Well, thank you, Rob, for that very generous welcome. I must admit that I accepted the invitation to launch this special mixture with a feeling of being at once honoured and challenged. I felt honoured because I know that the issue is a very precious thing to those who issued the invitation, and something in which some of the best and brightest of today's students and academics have invested much of themselves, not just their time, their energy, their intellect, their skills, but their aspirations to find in the law a way to live greatly in the years ahead. I felt challenged because I detected an expectation in the invitation. I was not being asked merely for exhibition as a founding relic of the law school, or to make the conventional polite remarks appropriate to such an occasion, but to respond in a meaningful way to the aspirations embodied in a social justice special issue. After all, UNSW is sometimes referred to pejoratively by some, approvingly by others, as the social justice law school. And for good or bad, I seem to be held responsible. So how could I meet such an expectation? I was 50 when I started the law school, and that was 40 years ago. A not inconsiderable gulf to bridge in speaking to today's students. Even so, I had not realised how great the gulf was until I read this journal and found a decision delivered while I was a student at law school by a judge before whom I later frequently appeared, cited as an example of the thinking of early colonists. Moreover, the journal is an academic production, rigorously so. And all pretensions aside, I am not an academic. Indeed, it was a condition of my appointment by the University of New South Wales that I was not an academic, for it had a policy that the founding dean of a professional faculty should be a practicing member of the profession. For the previous 20 years, I had been at the bar, and I took the proffered deanship, not because I wanted to become an academic, but because I wanted to realise a vision of a legal education that, in contrast to my own, would enrich the lives of students and produce the kind of practicing lawyer that I believe society needed. Was that a vision of a social justice law school? I am far from embarrassed by association with social justice, but I would never have thought in such terms. I'm proud that the law school flies near its entrance a banner with a quote from my dean's message to the first students, which Evelyn has already referred to, saying that a law school should have and communicate to its students a keen concern for those on whom the law may bear harshly. However, I always like to put those words in context by adding words that preceded it. And I quote, "We share the belief that law is not an end in itself. It is to be judged by the extent to which it promotes the well-being of people living in society. The worlds of the profession and of the wider university are important in a law school, but there are other worlds with which it should have contact. Some of these worlds, business, industry, trade unions, governments, supply much of the work and income of the profession and are not likely to be overlooked. But we believe that a law school should have and communicate to its students a keen concern for those on whom the law may bear harshly, either because they cannot afford its services or because it does not sufficiently recognise their needs or because they are in some way alienated from the rest of society. The poor, the Aborigines, the handicapped, the deviants all need their champions in the law as elsewhere. So the pursuit of social justice was not conceived as a separate mission of the law school. It was integral to and part of the basic mission of the law school to promote the well-being of people living in society, all people. When I was asked, as practitioners often ask me, whether the new law school would be practical or academic, my reply was always that it would be professional. I strongly held to the traditional view that a profession was granted special privileges in society in return for accepting three obligations: to provide the services that society needs in the areas of privilege, to take responsibility for the competence and integrity of its members, and to conserve, develop, and transmit the body of learning associated with its work. A law school was part of the legal profession, but with an independence appropriately guaranteed by the fact that it was also part of a university. It was part of this view that all members of the profession share its three obligations, with a law school having a specialist but not exclusive role in relation to the third obligation, the conservation, development, and transmission of learning. Is there then a difference in the intellectual worlds of the practitioner and the academic? There is, of course, a spectrum. At one end are people fully at home in both worlds, at the other end people comfortable only in one. I was one who felt more comfortable in practice, to which I returned as soon as the law school was up and running. I had not been an academic, but an entrepreneur establishing an institution who came from and returned to the practicing profession without becoming either a teacher or a scholar. There are, of course, functional differences between practitioners and academics, most basically that practitioners, in which category I include the judiciary, serve the needs of people with legal problems, while academics serve the very different needs of students. However, as a practice-oriented lawyer reading this journal, which I've been asked to launch, I became very conscious of other differences between the two spheres. Whereas the disposition of the practitioner is to jump in and find the ready solution to a problem, the disposition of academics is to reflect, to see a range of problems and solutions, and perhaps follow their reflections to other problems, even to the very nature of law, or the very nature of the problems, or perhaps of reflection itself. It led me to think of the range in another discipline, from industrially employed scientist to the pure scientist, who is so often treated disdainfully until someone realises that the pure science is the key to a billion-dollar market, or to saving millions from premature death, or perhaps to killing our rivals without getting hurt ourselves, or some other compelling problem of modern society. Of course, any good practitioner is reflective to some degree. When I was planning the law school in 1970, I sought out Dean Willard Pedrick because he had worked in Australian law schools before recently returning to found a new law school at Arizona State University. He told me that he had been surprised at the different ways American and Australian lawyers approached problems. An Australian lawyer would listen carefully to the facts, then say, oh, that's the case of so-and-so. Walk across the room and pull the appropriate volume off the shelf with uncanny precision. By contrast, an American lawyer would say, well, you could look at the problem this way, or you could look at it that way, or you could look at it another way. Which is the best way for us to look at it? And only after thoroughly interrogating the facts would the lawyer start looking at the authorities. I did my best to incorporate this anecdote into the received wisdom at our law school, but even applying it, one's imagination is constrained by existing categories and the interests of clients. The contributors to this special issue, however, illustrate the value of the free-ranging reflection open to academics. Brendan Edgeworth's masterly study gets us pointed in the right direction and knowing where we are coming from as we set out to explore some of the ways lawyers can approach social justice. Prompted by his study of artistic representations, Desmond Manderson notes that our notion of justice tends to be vague, whereas we usually perceive injustice in specific and concrete terms. It would be fine to live in a society in which social justice was a bit of a yawn, so taken for granted that we do not notice it, but examples of injustice seize our attention. The trouble is that if we do not have some criteria to challenge us, we may be blinded by ingrained ways of thinking or by prejudice or self-interest. And that is where the value of work, like that of contributors to this journal, comes in, challenging the basic assumptions we take for granted and making us realise that there are other ways of seeing the world. Emmanuel Voyakis, for example, suggests that we may be so blinded by ingrained assumptions about the purpose of the law of torts that we fail to explore other possibilities that might yield a better balance of social justice in our contemporary social structure. However, it is the three writers on Indigenous issues who make the greatest challenges to our complacency. The rigorous thinkers among you may have noticed that I've started to throw three words around somewhat loosely without defining them, so I had better explain. The three words are we, us, and our. As I talk them, their meaning will expand or contract according to the context. Sometimes, to take one example, they will include all Australians, sometimes only non-Indigenous Australians. Broadly, they will refer to members of the privileged group in the particular context, because that is the one I always belong to. They will also include, no doubt, many other people with a room, and each of you can decide your category for yourself. I return to the three papers on Indigenous issues, all of which have troubling implications for that ill-defined collective, us. Basking in the blessed relief of the post-Mabo and post-apology era, there is a real risk that, although we would never use such language, we will once again see ourselves as the virtuous and long-suffering bearers of the white man's burden. That posture surfaces in Shelley Bielfeld's account of the Northern Territory intervention, to which I will return later. Talia Anthony argues that the relatively sympathetic Fernando sentencing principles have given way to a more punitive approach, in which features of the Indigenous condition, once regarded as mitigating factors, now attract harsher sentences. She notes that there was no evidence of any effect of sentencing on crime rates which would justify such a change. This, of course, is par for the course. Incredibly, judges get no feedback whatsoever on the effect of their sentences. Honey Reiswyk's bold move in juxtaposing Carpentaria, the novel by the Indigenous writer Alexis Wright, to our law's account of relations between Indigenous people and the Australian state, initially irritated the practicing lawyer in me, who would present an argument based on a novel to the High Court. But that was not her proposal. She recognised that there was no space in today's common law to raise issues like competing sovereignties. Her purpose, successfully realised in my case at least, was rather to show how contingent is the framework on which we base our control of the continent. Alexis Wright, in her novel, looks at the world through the eyes of the Indigenous people who were here before our ancestors arrived with the guns that enabled them to impose a new founding myth in place of the myth of the rainbow serpent's creation of lands and peoples who went together. The bizarre new myth was a peaceful annexation under mysterious powers residing in an unknown and intermittently mad king on the other side of the world. It must have taken some understanding. Issues of legitimacy, sovereignty and compensation look very different from the other end of the telescope. Those of you who attended my eponymous lecture recently given by Sir Gerard Brennan may remember that I thanked him for his revision of our founding myth in the Mabo judgment. It hit me then how contingent our founding myth is. Someone else we have to thank is an old friend and colleague of mine, Ted Woodward QC, who back in 1971 advised the plaintiffs in the Gove case not to appeal Justice Blackburn's judgment rejecting the possibility of native title. Had he advised an appeal, the great probability is that the Barwick High Court would have cemented terra nullius into our jurisprudence, and we might be trying to support with a straight face the myth that Aboriginal people roamed over the land like birds and wild animals without asserting any title to it. Now, however, we are free to make the truthful statement. Yes, you owned the land, but we took it. Tough luck. Given that we have acquired most of the land formerly under native title, why do we not have to pay compensation for it? In Mabo, 3 judges, Dean, Gaudron and Toohey, thought we were liable, while 3, Mason, Brennan and McHugh, asserted with no very compelling reason that we were not. Our freedom from liability for compensation is based on recruiting the vote of the dissenting judge, Justice Dawson, who didn't address the issue in his judgment, but didn't have much time for native title anyway. You can't really get much more contingent than that. Shelley Bielefeld problematises the Northern Territory intervention, now euphemistically renamed Stronger Futures, by examining it through the lens of continuing colonialism. I confess to doubt that this remains the most useful approach for critiquing Australian policy towards Indigenous people. While it gives her a base from which to identify continuing practices and prejudices, and make telling criticisms of what has been done and the way in which it has been done, It may obscure perceptions of what is really happening in a post-colonial era. No doubt it is possible to find petty tyrants in the bureaucracy who still want to behave like colonial masters, but it is another thing to speak of an ongoing colonial project. Having recently spent a fortnight in a community subject to the intervention, I'm surprised to read of ongoing colonial violence that continues to attempt to break the spirit of Indigenous peoples and shatter their resistance to the imposition of colonial order. And I can see no ground to conclude that income management reflects the Darwinian assumption that Indigenous peoples are too childlike and simple-minded to deal with something as complicated as the cash economy, when the government justifies it as a response to quite specific problems with the support of Aboriginals like Noel Pearson, Marcia Langton and Bess Price, who has just been elected to the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly in a seat heavily impacted by the intervention. That said, I would agree with much of the author's criticism, but suggest that it is more profitable to look at what is happening as a modernisation project rather than a colonial project. The government is not seeking to hold Aboriginals in an unequal position, but is desperately striving to make them more equal in terms of the statistics by which progressive opinion and the United Nations judge the government. But it is hard to see how this can be achieved without more assimilation involving changes in lifestyle, which for perfectly rational reasons, Aboriginal people are in no hurry to adopt. I often think of a comedy show I saw many years ago on television when Goldie Hawn was asked, "Do you think President Johnson will win the war on poverty?" And she replies, "No, those poor people will never give in." Before we so brutally dispossessed them from their land, Aboriginals lived as hunter-gatherers. And although we have made it impossible to continue that way of life in full, a lot of the values of the former way of life survive in varying degrees in Aboriginal communities. 50 years ago, the American anthropologist Marshall Sahlins used Aboriginal examples in contrasting hunter-gatherer societies with market industrial societies such as our own, pointing to many ways in which the former offered more attractive lifestyles. The basic difference is that in hunter-gatherer societies, wants are few and easily satisfied in cooperative ways, leaving plenty of leisure that can be deployed in other ways, rest, recreation, sociality, or as in many Aboriginal societies, in an elaborate ceremonial life. And tellingly, there are no rich and no poor in these societies. Contrast our market industrial societies, which are dominated by the pursuit of ever greater wealth. Wants are unlimited and so can never be satisfied, even if we commit ourselves to long hours of work with little leisure. Some people monopolise the available work, leaving others in a state of unemployment, which in our society is far from enjoyable. In the unending pursuit of wealth, the environment is devastated, the atmosphere is polluted to a point where the balance of climate is destroyed, and wars are fought to control resources. As more and more people become obscenely rich, even greater numbers become poverty-stricken or displaced and seek to move to more favourable locations, testing the justice credentials of those already inhabiting those places. One interpretation of what we like to think is the Aboriginal problem is that many Aboriginals who still have a choice are too intelligent to join this madhouse. However, we undermine them by creating addictive wants for alcohol, drugs, cigarettes, and television, and subject them to the force of an advertising industry dedicated to creating wants where none exist. Some of this we do in the name of social justice, as for example when we insisted that Aboriginals should have equal access to alcohol. I've developed this point at some length not as a response to any of the papers in the journal, but as a challenge to our comfortable sense of ourselves as virtuous people engaged in good work such as social justice projects. We might ask ourselves whether we are not, in our whole lifestyle, in everything we do, contributing to the creation of the very injustices we seek to address. It is wholly admirable that lawyers should react to unfairness and exclusions in the operation of the law, as Bintran Noam and Michael Walpole do in relation to adjudication procedures in the taxation field, and Therese Wilson does in relation to access to small amounts of credit. I have nothing but admiration for the dedication of all the contributors to social justice and their work in seeking understanding of issues and thinking outside the square to find better ways to shape the law. However, they have taken the incautious step of stimulating a practitioner to reflect on the subject of social justice. The result has been my suggestion that we pause to remind ourselves that we are not only lawyers with responsibilities in the law, but also human beings, citizens of our country and citizens of the world, with wider responsibilities and our own impacts on the world. I have found stimulus to do this from reading this journal, and for that I would like to thank the editors and contributors as I formally launch this special social justice of the University of New South Wales Law Journal. Thank you.